She sat silently, composed, but within seconds, everything unraveled. Melania Trump didn't expect what Jasmine Crockett would say, and when the truth came out, she stood up and walked off. Right there, in front of everyone. It started with a silence so tense. You could hear the shuffle of papers and the faint hum of the cameras. The audience didn't know it yet, but they were seconds away from witnessing a moment that would ripple far beyond the studio lights. This wasn't just a political debate. It wasn't just another talk show discussion. It was a confrontation. And Jasmine Crockett was ready for it. The panel was full of well-known names, but all eyes naturally gravitated toward Melania Trump and Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett. On paper, they came from two different worlds. One, a former First Lady known for grace and quiet elegance. The other, a fierce, unapologetic voice in Congress who made headlines with her commanding presence. But on this day, their worlds were about to collide. The host kicked off the discussion on women's roles in shaping modern politics and public discourse. Melania, seated in her usual composed manner, spoke first. Her words were smooth, her delivery measured. She talked about loyalty, about standing by your partner through public scrutiny, and about how media often twists narratives. She referenced her Be Best campaign and briefly touched on her time in the White House. The audience nodded politely. It was everything they expected. But it was Jasmine Crockett's turn next, and what she said immediately shifted the energy. In the room, with a calm, almost surgical tone, Jasmine began, respectfully, I think there's a deeper question we're not asking when we talk about loyalty and leadership, especially when those two ideas start to blur. The host smiled, trying to keep things neutral. Melania tilted her head slightly, as if bracing for a typical political jab. But Jasmine wasn't interested in the usual talking points. She reached beside her chair and pulled out a slim folder. She placed it on the table in front of her, not dramatically, not for show, just with quiet precision. What happens, Jasmine continued, when loyalty becomes a curtain to hide behind, when elegance becomes a shield that blocks accountability? The host's expression stiffened. Melania blinked but didn't react outwardly. The audience leaned in. No one was breathing too loudly now. Jasmine flipped open the folder slowly, revealing a handful of printed pages, documents, highlighted passages, and what appeared to be handwritten notes. She didn't lift them, she didn't wave them in the air. Instead, she kept her hands folded neatly on the table and locked eyes with Melania. I came here today not to throw stones, she said clearly, but to ask a question I believe a lot of Americans are quietly wondering. Are we celebrating the image of integrity or the reality of it? A whisper moved through the studio. Melania's smile, faint and practiced until now, faltered. She turned her face slightly, eyes scanning the audience, then returning to Jasmine. Still, she didn't speak. Jasmine leaned forward, her voice unwavering. You once told a group of students that your word is your bond. But there are travel, records, fund, transfers, and sponsorship connections that suggest a very different story. Trips labeled as charity events that coincided with private stays. Speaking engagements with undisclosed benefactors. And yes, receipts that don't match the message. For the first time, Melania visibly stiffened. She adjusted her chair slightly. Her hands clutched the armrest, not aggressively, but not casually either. The host interjected weakly. Let's try to keep this civil. It is civil, Jasmine replied, but truth can be uncomfortable. And silence shouldn't be confused with dignity when questions go unanswered. That line landed like a thunderclap. Melania didn't answer. Not yet. She simply stared at Jasmine for a long, drawn-out moment, her lips pressed tightly together. The air around them seemed to thicken. No one knew what would happen next, but they could feel it. Something real was unfolding. Jasmine didn't gloat. She didn't press further. She just sat back, hands folded, and allowed the silence to settle. The truth wasn't shouted. It wasn't sensationalized. It was laid bare, quietly and calmly, and that somehow made it hit even harder in that moment. The balance shifted not through aggression or spectacle, but through poise, evidence, and a question that struck deeper than anyone expected. And it all began with a sentence Jasmine Crockett wasn't supposed to say, but said anyway. Asterisk, the shift in energy didn't just come from Jasmine's words. It came from her precision. The panel discussion had been moving along predictably. Topics like diplomacy, image, family, and media criticism were thrown around like softballs. Melania had taken her turn with polished remarks about personal sacrifice, the importance of dignity in the public eye, and the strain the White House years had placed on her family. She spoke softly, with poise, painting herself as someone who had weathered unfair attacks and emerged stronger. Then came Jasmine's turn again. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't challenge the words directly. What she did was far more powerful. She drew a line between public image and private reality. She made it clear that the conversation couldn't continue without confronting the gaps between the two. With calm determination, Jasmine opened the folder she'd placed on the table earlier. She never lost her smile, but the weight of her intent was unmistakable. Slowly, methodically, she began to read from a sheet of paper. The studio lights reflected off the glossy cover as she flipped the page, and the camera subtly zoomed in. April 11, 2019. Private round-trip flight from Washington, D.C. to Palm Beach, booked under a non-governmental alias. Cost covered by an educational non-profit linked to the Be Best campaign. No public event listed on the calendar for that date. No press coverage, no recorded donation to the non-profit. Since Jasmine looked up not at the host, not at the audience, but directly at Melania. I'm sure there's a reasonable explanation, she added calmly. But the question is, why hasn't one ever been offered? Melania didn't blink. She adjusted in her seat and gave a composed, almost rehearsed smile. I'm not here to go back and forth on rumors, she said softly. Much of what people speculate is misinformation. These attacks are not new to me. Jasmine didn't flinch. I agree. Speculation isn't helpful. That's why I brought documents. The room grew cold with anticipation. The host shifted in his chair, nervously adjusting his earpiece. A few guests looked down at the table, uncomfortable, while others stole glances between the two women. Jasmine didn't stop there. She continued to calmly list. Another example, a charitable foundation linked to children's mental health that reportedly paid for a luxury suite in Vienna during a private advocacy visit. But the trip had no photographs, no speech, no known meetings. Jasmine read the name of the foundation's listed director, a longtime associate of Melania's private office. Again, no formal public record of how the funds were used. Then came the question that cracked the air like lightning. Was that trip really for children's education or something more personal? This time Melania's response was slower. Her lips parted slightly as if to reply, but no words came. Instead, she gave a look to the host, an unmistakable signal that she was not willing to continue down that path. The host, trying to salvage the moment, interjected. All right, ladies, let's pivot to another topic, perhaps public expectations for women in the spotlight. But the pivot didn't work. The damage was done. The audience could feel it. Melania was no longer answering. From a position of poise she was shielding herself, and Jasmine had done it all without making a single direct accusation. She had simply asked questions, offered receipts, presented facts, and that's when the dynamic on stage completely changed. Melania's posture, once tall and confident, now tightened. She crossed her arms, lightly, not defensively, but with subtle tension. Her voice, when she finally spoke again, was quieter, measured, almost hesitant. I believe in privacy, she said, especially when so many things are taken out of context. Jasmine's reply was quick, but soft. Public figures aren't entitled to privacy when it concerns public funds. That's not scrutiny. That's accountability. It was the moment the tables turned, not because Jasmine attacked Melania, but because she placed a mirror in front of her, forcing her to look. What began as a routine discussion about the pressures of public life had become something far more uncomfortable. Jasmine hadn't come to debate opinions, she came armed with facts. She brought clarity into a room that had grown too comfortable with blurred lines, and Melania, for all her elegance, suddenly looked unprepared. The audience remained quiet. Even the producers behind the camera didn't seem to know how to break the tension. There was no shouting, no dramatic outbursts, but something far more compelling had just happened. Jasmine had seized control of the moment, not with volume, but with truth, and in doing so, she changed the course of the conversation entirely. It happened quickly, but the weight of the moment made it feel like time had slowed. After Jasmine, Crockett calmly laid out a second example, an international trip funded under a non-profit tied to Melania's former initiatives. Everyone in the room could sense the air thickening with pressure. Jasmine wasn't flustered. She wasn't even emotional. She simply paused and let her words hang in the space between them. Melania sat still, too still. There was no angry outburst, no interruption. She simply adjusted the position of her hands in her lap, looked briefly at the documents on the table in front of Jasmine, and then raised her chin as if steadying herself. Then she spoke softly and with carefully chosen words. I'm not here to discuss private matters, she said, her voice calm but clipped. I think it's best if we remember the purpose of this conversation. The host nodded quickly, trying to recenter the discussion. Of course, Let's steer the dialogue toward solutions, how public figures can better balance transparency and personal dignity. But Jasmine wasn't finished. Respectfully, she leaned forward again. With all due respect, Mrs. Trump, it becomes a public matter when public resources are involved. When platforms funded by taxpayers are potentially used for personal benefit, we have a responsibility to ask questions. I'm not suggesting anything, I'm just reading what's on paper. And just like that, the moment cracked. Melania exhaled quietly and gave a faint, tight-lipped smile. But this smile didn't hold the same confidence as before. It was the kind of smile people give when they're done talking, when they've decided nothing more can be said without giving away too much. She reached for the microphone clipped to her lapel and, with deliberate precision, unhooked it. The host, now visibly uncomfortable, tried to lighten the mood. I'm sure we're just dealing with a misunderstanding, perhaps. There's documentation we haven't seen. Melania stood, that it wasn't an outburst. There were no dramatic gestures. She didn't storm off. She simply rose from her chair, with a grace that only made the tension more surreal. Her designer heels clicked softly against the floor as she stepped away from the table. She didn't look at Jasmine. She didn't glance at the host or the audience. She just left. The audience didn't gasp. They didn't applaud. They just stared, wide-eyed, trying to comprehend what had just happened. Melania Trump, former First Lady of the United States, had silently exited a live studio conversation, not because she was shouted at or interrupted, but because a calm, prepared woman asked questions she didn't want to answer. Jasmine remained seated. She didn't gloat. She didn't smirk. She simply watched Melania leave, then turned back to the host. The host fumbled briefly, trying to regain composure. Well, this has taken an unexpected turn. Congresswoman Crockett, would you like to continue the conversation? Jasmine nodded. I think we should, she replied. Because this isn't about personal attacks. This is about accountability, and the fact that no one, no matter how prominent or polished, should be above being asked to explain their use of influence. Her tone never rose. She didn't indulge in drama, but was the most striking part. There were no insults, no theatrics. Jasmine Crockett had handled the moment like a seasoned prosecutor, presenting facts, asking measured questions, and staying composed even as the person across from her walked away. Some guests at the table looked down, unsure of what to say. One woman cleared her throat, another adjusted her blazer, clearly uncomfortable. Everyone was thinking the same thing, but no one wanted to say it. Melania walked away from a conversation she couldn't control. It wasn't about humiliation. It wasn't even about guilt. It was about discomfort, the kind that arises when someone is confronted by truth they weren't expecting, and that's what made the walk-off so unforgettable. It wasn't loud. It was quiet. It was deliberate. It was graceful on the surface, but explosive in its implication. Melania's departure wasn't just a personal reaction. It was a statement, a choice to exit rather than explain. And Jasmine, she didn't chase her down. She didn't press further. She simply let the silence fill the room. Then she leaned back in her chair, folded her hands and said, "Sometimes the truth speaks loudest when it's met with silence." And in that silence, everyone realized this wasn't just another political exchange. This was a reckoning, and it had just unfolded live before their eyes. By the time Melania Trump stepped off the stage, the room wasn't just filled with tension, it was filled with questions. And not just about what had happened, but why it had happened. Viewers, panelists, and even the host were trying to piece it together. Jasmine Crockett hadn't screamed. She hadn't accused Melania of anything illegal. And yet, her steady, deliberate revelations had been powerful enough to make a former First Lady abandon a live discussion. The question lingered like fog. What exactly was the hidden truth Jasmine had exposed? The truth, as Jasmine had hinted, wasn't just about a single event, it was about a pattern. A subtle but troubling overlap between public service and private benefit. And while Jasmine never accused Melania of wrongdoing, she methodically painted a picture of blurred lines and unanswered questions. Let's break it down. Jasmine presented a timeline of several trips taken by Melania during her time as First Lady, trips that were officially labeled as charitable outreach, educational visits, or wellness campaigns. But Jasmine juxtaposed those dates with luxury accommodations, anonymous donors, and closed-door engagements that weren't part of any published White House schedule. Take, for instance, the Palm Beach trip she mentioned. Jasmine noted how the event was marketed as a school visit, yet there was no photographic evidence, no press release, and no statement afterward. What was found, however, was a financial report showing that a small non-profit organization whose only major donor was a private company with connections to Melania's stylist, had covered the travel and lodging expenses. It didn't stop there. Jasmine highlighted a second trip, this time overseas. A wellness awareness initiative in Europe was cited as the reason for the visit, yet records from a European resort listed a private event booking under a name strongly linked to Melania's inner circle. Again, the trip had no visible public-facing deliverables, no interviews, no school visits, no policy speeches, just a 4-day stay at one of the most expensive wellness retreats in the region. The deeper issue wasn't just whether Melania had used her influence to live luxuriously, was whether she had quietly used public goodwill and charitable networks to do so, while hiding behind a veil of advocacy work. Jasmine never once said Melania committed a crime. She didn't need to. Instead, she asked hard questions. Why were the funds for certain trips sourced from newly created non-profits, with unclear mission statements? Why did these trips avoid the press despite being linked to national campaigns? Why did documentation about these events only surface when third-party financial audits were conducted, never voluntarily released? These weren't accusations, they were open doors, and Jasmine simply handed viewers the key. She reminded the audience of Melania's own words during her White House years, her emphasis on integrity, on children's mental health, and on the dignity of public service. Jasmine then calmly placed that narrative beside the financial and logistical inconsistencies, creating a contrast too sharp to ignore, and that was the heart of it. The hidden truth wasn't a smoking gun, it was a quiet erosion of trust. It was the realization that behind every polished campaign, behind every carefully curated public appearance, there might be something else, a network of influence, working silently behind the scenes for reasons that were never publicly disclosed. Jasmine didn't need drama. Her facts spoke for themselves. What made her revelations so devastating was their elegance. They were presented like a well-built legal argument, documented, timed, cross-referenced, and measured. She didn't demand outrage. She invited scrutiny. And perhaps most powerful of all was this: Jasmine never claimed to have uncovered everything. She made it clear she was only scratching the surface. Her message wasn't "here's what Melania did wrong." It was "here's what we're not being told. Isn't it time we start asking why?" That, more than anything, shook the room, because when you realize that someone so publicly associated with grace, style, and dignity might have quietly sidestepped accountability not through overt corruption, but through silence and presentation, it rattles the foundation of trust. Melania's walk-off wasn't just an exit. It was a reaction to being confronted with something she wasn't prepared to address, not because the questions were loud, but because they were precise. Jasmine had found the hairline cracks in the narrative and tapped them gently, and when they started to spread, Melania left the room. The truth Jasmine exposed wasn't about drama. It was about responsibility, and once responsibility is questioned, especially under the lights of a live stage, walking away doesn't make the questions disappear. The moment Melania walked off the stage, everything changed. What had started as a standard panel discussion turned into something far more impactful, a turning point, not because of outrage or theatrics or political posturing, but because, for once, a powerful figure didn't have a prepared answer, and that silence, that graceful but unmistakable retreat, said more than words ever could. Jasmine Crockett remained seated as the studio buzzed with uncertainty. The host stammered through a few words, clearly trying to decide whether to move forward or call for a break. The other panelists, once lively and engaged, looked down or away, unsure if they should comment or stay silent. But Jasmine didn't flinch. She adjusted her microphone and leaned slightly forward. Her voice was low and steady. "I didn't come here to win an argument," she said. "I came here to remind people that when you accept the trust of the public, that trust comes with questions, and those questions don't go away just because you leave the room." It was a moment of calm clarity. There was no gloating, no sarcasm, no triumph, just a sense of responsibility, of duty. Jasmine wasn't there to score points. She was there to hold the line, and that's when the audience began to react, not with cheers or gasps, but with something far more powerful: quiet attention. People sat straighter in their seats. A few nodded. Even the most neutral faces began to change, their expressions shifting from uncertainty to recognition. This wasn't just about Melania Trump anymore. It was about something larger, something deeper. It was about what happens when image begins to replace accountability, when celebrity and politics blur so tightly that people forget the difference between being admired and being answerable. Jasmine continued, speaking not just to the panel, But to anyone who had ever looked at a public figure and assumed the surface told the whole story, it's easy to get distracted by Polish, she said. But the truth rarely shines on its own. You have to dig for it. You have to be willing to ask uncomfortable questions. And you have to be prepared when those questions make people walk away. Her words hung in the air like a challenge not to Melania, but to the audience, to the viewers, to anyone watching from the sidelines thinking, someone else will speak up, someone else will ask the hard things. After the show there was no post-show handshake, no summary wrap-up where everyone smiles for the camera. The panel ended quietly. The credits rolled over a still room, but outside the studio, the conversation had only just begun. People started to talk not about gossip or scandal, but about transparency. They began revisiting the things Jasmine had brought up, the travel records, the funding patterns, the unspoken tension between privilege and public service. Other guests on the panel, some of whom had originally prepared to talk about unrelated topics, later admitted they were caught off guard by Jasmine's composure and depth. One panelist off camera said, "I've never seen someone stay that calm while being that sharp. It was like watching a courtroom cross-examination with no courtroom." The host, in later interviews, admitted he hadn't known how far Jasmine would go, but he acknowledged that she didn't cross any lines. She simply held up a mirror and let others decide whether they wanted to look. In political circles, the moment was replayed and analyzed again and again. Some claimed Jasmine had gone too far, while others said she hadn't gone far enough. But regardless of opinions, one thing was certain: she had changed the conversation. And as for Melania, she never released a direct statement about the incident. There were no public denials, no clarifications, just silence. A silence that only fueled curiosity and speculation, not because she had been exposed, but because she had been challenged and chose not to respond. In the days that followed, the questions Jasmine raised didn't disappear. In fact, they began to echo louder. Quietly at first in academic circles, political blogs, and interviews. Then more boldly, as investigative minds took a closer look at what had been presented. But Jasmine, she returned to her work. She didn't campaign on the moment. She didn't celebrate it. She moved forward, reminding people that the real work isn't in the spotlight, it's in what happens when the lights go off. And the questions still remain. Because in the end, the most powerful part of the confrontation wasn't the walk-off. It was what came after, the silence that followed, and the truth that refused to fade with it.